And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Jacob Horne, who is the Chief Security Evangelist for Summit 7. Jacob, thank you very much for joining me. Much appreciated. How are you?
I'm excellent, David. Thank you for having me. I'm a big fan.
Thank you very much. So before we dive in, and I would love to discuss, the topics you're subject matter expert on, like, CMMC and others,
sure, yeah.
Compliance. But before we jump into that, I noticed you have incredible background, and you started in the Navy.
That's right. Yeah.
So why don't we kind of, just to set the stage and provide some clout to what you're going to be talking next?
Sure.
Because you carry a tremendous clout. So maybe you kind of walk me through the career path.
Yeah, it was definitely not anything that was planned out from the beginning. It was all, sort of happenstance and just sort of following one adventure to the next. So I originally wanted to be a firefighter when I grew up, and turns out paramedic school is quite expensive. So I joined the Navy to get the GI Bill and the extra points on the exam. And when I was taking the the aptitude tests, they said, "Yeah, you don't want to be a firefighter. You want to do something cool and like in the intelligence field." And I said, "No, I'm pretty sure I want to be a firefighter." They're like, "Well, how about this signing bonus?" I said, "Well, what's firefighting?" So a few years go by. And I end up going to, intelligence and analysis school with a focus on cybersecurity. I ended up being an intelligence analyst at NSA, which was an awesome experience. Right about the time when U.S. Cyber Command was just becoming a thing. I mean, this was really the era pre-Snowden when everybody was slowly figuring out that cybersecurity mattered for everything, everywhere, all the time, which has been a really fascinating thing to see the landscape evolve, because some of the skills and threat intel and open source intelligence that you can just learn on Coursera now were the types of things that you wouldn't ever be able to learn 15 years ago unless you were somewhere like the agency. So I walked around various work centers in my time there, which was great. Rotated to a different duty station while I was in the Navy, stationed out of San Diego, where I did a lot of blue team assessments for shipboard networks across the Pacific, which was really cool. Get to fly in helicopters and then show up and do vulnerability scans. So it was, it was a lot of fun, a big adventure for that. Got out of the Navy and ended up working in weapon system acquisitions, which seems very boring and low speed compared to what I was doing on active duty. But it was actually very interesting because all of the vulnerabilities that we would read about in the headlines, or all of the vulnerabilities that we would find doing an assessment, were of weapon systems and networks that were already, in the field. And a lot of times they would have issues that were baked into those systems because of decisions that were made in the acquisition process. And nobody wants to learn about acquisitions, so the problem would just perpetuate. So of course, being a glutton for punishment, I was like, well, I'll learn about acquisitions. So I went and worked at the program office at MilSatcom, and then went over and worked at a prime integrator at Northrop Grumman. And throughout that time, I realized that that was really the main leverage point for trying to inject better security into these government systems and networks, because if you didn't get it right when you designed it, then you're always just playing whack-a-mole down the line. It's very easy to sort of point the finger at the people operating the systems. You have to go, this is the ultimate shift left, is to go into government acquisitions. Around about that time, working at Northrop Grumman, I got a chance to work on a very rapid acquisition for a cool satellite system, and we got much closer to our supply chain, which was typically not a conversation that would happen on these big, long acquisitions. And that's when I came across a document called NIST SP 800-171, which was this weird baby version of these big federal requirements that I had been working with.
And Jacob, you fell in love.
I fell in love, and I couldn't resist. I glutton for punishment. And I said, what does that mean? And why is it so painful? And sure enough, the last several years was just sort of pulling on that thread and peeling the onion back and realizing that all of the issues that we had seen in the federal systems and military systems existed in spades in the supply chain that, supported those systems. And because of the way that the information has flowed throughout this environment over the years, there's no clear line between these two worlds anymore. So for the last few years, I've been specifically focused on trying to do some sense making between the two worlds, right? Of they're fundamentally the same requirements. Here's how to understand them. Here's how they play in terms of the landscape of regulatory requirements versus general security programs. And it's just been this really, fun adventure from joining the military all the way through to here. It's really the same. It's just a series of chapters of the same story. Haven't really pivoted into fundamentally different work. It's all been different facets around the same core, but now it's actually become more and more relevant instead of some obscure adventure, because a lot of businesses are finding out that experiences like that are quite relevant to their ability to understand their requirements. Whereas before, you were just some guy that had been in the military for a while. So it's been pretty crazy to see it sort of come together here.
Yeah, it's a really incredible journey. And you glanced over a few things that I would love to, pull the thread on, because you came through so quickly. But and we'll jump into the kind of the CMMC.
Sure,
and I've watched some of your videos, and they're amazing. Like I don't think anybody on the web or on the interweb can explain CMMC so well like you do. And I've seen the historical session of you.
It's the worst superpower ever.
But it's one that people need, and especially those government contractors. But let me ask you this. You said, and you glanced over so quickly. There's something about your attributes and qualities. You went through an aptitude test, like early days, and they say, well, we want you to do this job, and we're willing to pay for it. So you forget about your aspirations.
That's
to
right.
become something else. What was it? And again, you glanced right over it, but they handpick the people, like yourself. It's not like, that, like, I don't know what the numbers are, but the percentage is pretty low for the people that get picked to be these intelligence analysts. What do you think that were the qualities that you carried back, back then and still today?
Yeah, well, definitely. It's interesting, right? The ASVAB, the aptitude battery test that you have to take to enlist in the military, is very, very good at evaluating what you have an aptitude for. So, for instance, after I took the exam, they said, we're not letting you anywhere near anything mechanical because you're going to blow everything up. We're not letting you repair anything. At the time, remember, this was all pre-Cybercom. This was pre-10th Fleet. This was pre-cybersecurity as a thing that people knew about. So I would actually have to go back and look and see what the scores were. Primarily at the time, if your language skills were particularly good, or if your math skills were particularly good, then you were sort of positioned towards general analysis, if you will, from there. Whereas I believe now it's much more refined to the types of cybersecurity work that are, that have sort of crystallized. But back then, everybody was essentially a general analyst, like an overall all-around analyst, all source intelligence was the term that they used, with you just got extra training in cybersecurity. So I would have to look and see how they evaluated it, but it was a combination of sort of math, abstract reasoning, language skills, those sorts of things, but it was distinctly not mechanical skill in any way, because there's people out there working on jet engines, and if it were up to me, they'd just flop right off the side. It wouldn't be very good.
and this is always reminds me that you always focus on your strength and not try to improve your weaknesses.
Yeah,
best bet.
Yeah, it's interesting, how good the exam is, because it's very interesting. I was on active duty because you would get this very diverse group of people who all had your same job, right? So, for instance, we were all Intel analysts, or you're all aircraft mechanics, or you're all nuclear technicians, and you'd have people from all walks of life, all genders, all backgrounds, but they would all have the same aptitude for the job that they did, which is a very, I know this is sort of maybe far away from what people were expecting the podcast to be on, but it's a really interesting phenomenon because you have very diverse teams, but they all have the same aptitude. So they end up working together as teams very well, which I think is maybe one of the secrets behind why a lot of those military teams are so high performing.
Yeah, very successful. And it's almost like they make you go through that, filter where, it's almost like if you think about like manufacturing line, and I know we get into this particular topic, but I think it is really super interesting. And it's really interesting for several reasons, because one is I believe that it was fundamental to your career path. You were chosen to be an analyst, and then you went from there and you developed a very successful career. But, so they go through a filter, and then they kind of redirected like almost like a line in manufacturing facilities where, depending on your qualities, selecting wood, for example, this wood goes into furniture, this one goes into the fire pit.
Your aptitudes fit into that slot, and we have an open slot, so we got a job for you. So a manufacturing line's probably a pretty good metaphor. I mean, it's the military is an industrial machine, and they're very good at turning out training, which, if anybody's listening who's interested, a career in the military is a big commitment. And, I did 8 years. I didn't do a full 20, but the amount of training and resources that you get along with experience over the course of 4 to 8 years, so 1 to 2 enlistments, can just rocket you forward. I mean, one of the biggest issues that we have in the cybersecurity field is minimum experience requirements for entry-level work. There is no minimum experience requirement if you're going to join the military, if you're young enough, or if that's an option for you. It's just whether you have the aptitude. So it is a path that I think maybe a lot of people don't think of at first. But if you do it right, then I did it. It was purely by chance. But if you sort of know what you're looking for, there's a lot of resources out there for how to target the job that you want. At least now, those jobs are more well-defined, and it's an interesting perspective. I mean, it completely changed the trajectory of my life. So I'm definitely grateful for all the things that it gave me. I mean, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that. So.
Yeah. And this is why I dwell on it, because there's a lot of people that watch this. Sometimes they ask, okay, how do I get in, and what's in it for me? And there's a lot of areas, even parents that are listening to this and will say, well,
sure,
how do I, kind of get my kids to be able to be successful? And this is another interesting piece, that these exams, and we dwell on it because, again, I think that's of interest to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about your transition from the military to the civilian life as well. But sometimes you cannot learn. It's not like you can. These exams are not necessarily things you can. It's not like an LSAT or SAT or whatever. It's very tough to learn. It's something you have to learn very early childhood and be kind of interested in and get familiarized. Again, it's not something you can like cram 2 weeks before the exam.
I mean, I think they sell books where you can sort of study for the ASVAB, but. Whether you want to like study for the ASVAB or you just want to sort of let the ASVAB sorting hat decide what Harry Potter house you're going to be in if you join the military. I think it's, it sort of gets to a bigger idea that I tell a lot of people who are, they're entry level or they're looking to get into cybersecurity. I tell them, the military is not for everybody. It shouldn't be the only path that people back in the day, if you wanted to get into cybersecurity, I mean, that was one of the only ways to really inject yourself into it. I mean, I didn't even know it was a field until I joined the military. The nice part is that the community and the industry and the resources now are just insane on the outside. So you can really do both. I tell people that the best thing you can do is follow whatever you're curious about, because there's a lot of things involved with cybersecurity. For instance, policy and regulation, not at all interesting, incredibly boring to have to deal with, unless you're curious about them. If you're curious about it, I mean, you can you can learn assembly code and become a malware reverse engineer and be amazing. If you're curious, if you're sort of forcing yourself to learn it, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So I tell people, to the best extent possible, if you're curious about something, pen testing or policy or whatever it happens to be, try to foster that curiosity and dive into security from that angle. Eventually, all of the other pieces will start to make sense. But if it just really helps accelerate your ability to sift through how things are working and what matters and what doesn't, without getting too bored, because there's just so much information, and a lot of it a lot of it's not all that interesting unless it's interesting to you. So, yeah, whether you're doing the ASVAB or you're doing it, not through the military, I always tell people just whatever you're curious about, foster that, and then start using that as the lens that you evaluate what you're going to learn or what you're going to study or who you're going to talk to. And that can help kickstart things.
Yeah, and you have the ability to be exposed to a lot of different things in the military as well, because the way they, once they assign you to a role, they start looking, evaluating you on a regular basis and see, okay, well, there's some other areas you can excel in and so on. And then you also double click on one thing that you mentioned is, I think, also paramount. You mentioned, and I know it's true from interviewing a lot of folks that were in the military, the level of intensity associated with this type of training. It's not like a course you take at, A+, or whatever course, whatever, name a course there. Right. It's like you live and breathe this for a long period of time. Yep. Almost like 10, 12 hours a day. Yeah. I mean, you condense so much, maybe you can talk to me about that, because that's not, people are not familiar with that process. Yeah. I mean, that's probably one of the more valuable ways of how they run things, at least, especially at the time when I was in. I haven't been in for a little while now, but your job is to be well trained on whatever your job is. So if you're a welder, right, your job is to be good at welding. If you're a cybersecurity analyst, your job is to be good at being a cybersecurity analyst. And one of the things that the military is famously good at is maintaining readiness. And so a lot of times that's for, combat units or combat troops being ready all the time. Weapons are ready all the time. It extends to the training and readiness of all the jobs in the military, which means that in a field like cybersecurity, you typically don't have to fight for training. Continuously training and learning is the job. So, it's great, right? There's a never ending amount of things to learn, but you just sort of get that idea ingrained in you very early that continuously training and going to training is just sort of part of the job, which ideally, and I think this is probably common across most of the security industry, that's not a foreign concept to most folks. It might be foreign to some employers that they need to continuously send their people to training. But especially in a field like security, it's just too dynamic and it's just changing all the time. Your skills will atrophy if you don't use them. You'll miss out on what's coming if you're not going to training. There's a never ending amount of things to learn. There's free training, there's paid training, there's all this stuff. The trick is just sort of internalizing that there is no point at which you are now, you now know everything that you need to know, and then you sort of continue on. I mean, there's been probably more technical roles that I've been in the past where it was more focused. There have been less technical roles, working in sort of governance and compliance, but you're sort of constantly having to learn and cross these boundaries. So it's great if you have some form of curiosity about what you're working on, because that means that this constant training and relearning doesn't feel like a chore, because that you're following what's relevant, you're following what you're interested in, which is why it can be so difficult, I think, if they have maybe a preconceived notion of what domain of security they might want to work in or that they ought to work in, because you're never going to stop learning this stuff. So if you work on something you're interested in, which it might take a while before you figure out what that is. I mean, this is a sort of a privileged piece of advice. But if you can find the thing that you're interested in, it really smooths out that process, because I wake up and read NIST publications and federal regulations. I mean, I'm brushing my teeth and reading away, and I'm like, this is great. But for most people, if they have to open a NIST document, then they're asleep. So their talents are probably better pointed somewhere else. And then all together, we can maybe start to make more sense of what's going on. So, yeah, I think fostering curiosity facilitates training, and that makes you better over time. So, and the other piece is that you can find yourself very quickly, despite the kind of a junior role, being responsible over some areas with cardinal importance. Like you can be an analyst that does some work that floats all the way to the top to potential president level just by doing some research. And so you almost instantaneously carry that a lot of weight. It's not like in the civilian, like let's say you join an enterprise, a large enterprise, and you're like a cog in the machine, and you're responsible for maybe like a endpoint security or some, or network security, and then something happens, the only impacts maybe that group or like the company. Here, you can be working on things of matter of national security with, greater impact.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well.
I mean, it's definitely an awesome perspective when you join up, is that, you're part, I mean, they grind this into you from day one of boot camp, that you are now suddenly part of something bigger than yourself. It's a very interesting perspective. It's actually been one of the perspectives that has informed a lot of sort of the training and content that I've developed regarding some of these regulations, right? I mean, there is a bigger tapestry at work here, and small companies, large companies in the private sector that constitute part of the supply chain of the defense industrial base are just as much a part of that tapestry as the random person who joined the military to go to firefighting school. But most companies don't imagine themselves as being a pawn on the chessboard of this larger machine and the larger machinery of geopolitics. And so when you tell them that there are cybersecurity requirements and there are regulations and there are this and there are that, they just seem like these, arbitrary barriers. And if you're able to sort of see the bigger picture, part of which is informed by my time in the military or people who've done federal cybersecurity work, it just becomes easier to connect those dots. It doesn't seem so narrow and arbitrary. Now, that doesn't mean that it's efficient, and there's a lot of room for improvement, but it's not made up. It's not superfluous. It's there for a reason. So.
Yeah. And to their defense, if you're a small company manufacturing some widgets for, air defense missile system or whatever the case may be, and all you have to remember is that you have to do payroll in the next couple of weeks, and you got to get the next contract, and you got to figure all things out. It's tough to see the bigger picture. I tell people all the time, if you just randomly walk in, I've worked with a lot of machine shops, a lot of sub-tier small companies who are in the DoD supply chain, and they're by and large, these are all salt of the earth, patriotic, flag waving people who love being part of the bigger picture. But if you walk into that office and you tell them that they are in the middle, they are the front lines of a geopolitical Cold War between the United States and China run through their machine shop, they're going to call the cops. They'll be like, "You sound crazy. We make parts here. What are you talking about?" So in my mind, and this maybe probably segues into some more stuff around DFARS and CMMC, but it's really a breakdown, I think, of the DoD's. The DoD hasn't done a good job of telling this story, right? And so you end up with these requirements dropped on you. You end up with some crazy guy with a beard on LinkedIn yakking all day. You're like, where is all this coming from? What is going on? And I think that the DoD probably has the perspective of why it matters, why it's here, how we've gotten here, where we're going, and they don't really convey that story very well. Which I think, the best of my ability, I've tried to fill that gap and try to pull those pieces together and say, this is how we got here, this is why it is the way it is, this is where it's going, and so that sort of is where I've made content and tried to sort of inject some sense making around the issue, because the DoD is not that great at marketing. I mean, they're just not, and I don't think they're going to be any good at it anytime soon. But primarily, I've found that, explaining these regulations through telling a story helps people make sense of something that's otherwise extremely boring, that they're not going to read and understand on their own. So, I think it's been an interesting adventure for the last few years, because that's definitely not what I thought I would be doing when I joined the Navy. Well, but that's why, partially why I wanted to have you here specifically to talk about that. And I love that you mentioned specifically, it takes a village, right? It's a collective effort to make sure that everybody understands these regulations are not just necessarily, they're not just to inhibit business. This is a matter of national security at the end of the day. Yeah. But it's hard to connect the dot, and we need more people like ourselves to go on, and hopefully some of these people will play this in their workshop.
Yeah, I mean, if it helps, a couple light bulbs go off here and there, or what I always tell people is, this isn't, whenever I make some of these, tell these stories or make, videos and things like that, I'm not finger wagging at people. Like, I'm not saying that the regulations are perfect with the way that they are. It's just that they're not arbitrary. I mean, there's definitely room to improve them and make them better, automate as much as possible. There's nothing keeping anything in the status quo. But typically what has happened over time is that people sort of, through one way or another, suddenly realize that these regulations are coming their way. And their first reaction is, how do I make those regulations not come my way? And problem is that's not a possibility, right? They are inevitable in terms of the path that we are on through this longer, larger story of CMMC and controlled unclassified information. So by telling the bigger story and sort of laying the groundwork of what's possible and what's not, why things are the way they are and how they could change, it allows the larger conversation to be more productive. Like when we give feedback to the DoD or to NIST or to the government, and we say things ought to change this way or things ought to change that way, where the leverage points are for affecting change if you can see the bigger picture. If you submit, and there's examples of this in the past where we have seen multiple times during the process of making the regulations that the public has submitted comments to the government around various themes like costs or impact or minimums. And the government has always responded in the same way. If you didn't know that and you're sort of new to this conversation, you're probably going to make the same arguments to the government and you're going to get the same answers. So instead of doing that, if we can pull the camera back a little bit, we can not ask those questions, maybe ask them in a different way, or realize that they're a lost cause and how we can sort of affect change in different ways. It just isn't as simple as, well, let me put it this way. These regulations have been coming for longer than the last 6 to 18 months, right? This has been a process, an evolutionary process over the last decade.
Yeah, I saw that. It's part of some of the videos that you published are kind of the history, and we're talking about way back 2002.
I mean, the real irony here, so just the quick summary is that CMMC, eventually, derived from the CUI program, the Controlled Unclassified Information Program. How that happened, we can talk about in a few minutes. But after 9/11, the government, and everybody found out the government's not very good at sharing information. But it wasn't just classified information, it was also unclassified information. Law enforcement agencies, state and local governments, they had information around, terrorism activity and, things like that they couldn't share readily. So the government tried for years to facilitate sharing this information. And what they did was they told all these organizations, mark your data so that you can, keep it under wraps. We don't want to just put it out there publicly. Mark your data and then we can share it. And then what ended up happening was all these different organizations marked everything in a different and unique way, so that when they went to go share with each other, they would look at the markings and they'd go, I don't know what any of this means. So then everyone stopped. It made sharing worse. It actually made it worse.
And what was driving the sharing piece? Like, talk to me about specifically, because you have to have information sharing across industry, because otherwise you can't conduct business, right?
Yeah, it was driven almost specifically out of the post 9/11 Commission report. And so when the government said, mark your data, protect it so we can share it, it had the inadvertent effect of making things worse. So then for years and years, we tried to pull all that stuff out and make sharing happen. It wasn't happening. Finally, Obama gets elected and he gets everybody together. He gets all the agencies together, big family meeting. And he goes, listen, we got to come up with a plan for a single marking system, a single sharing system. You tell me what that needs to look like and I'll put it in an executive order. So all the agencies got together and they said, here are these 40 things that we want. We want a single marking system. We want a single set of regulations to protect the data, blah, blah, blah. He puts it in the executive order, and that's really the big bang moment that said, hey, the government deals with lots of unclassified information that still should be confidential. It should only be shared with people that it needs to be shared with, but it's not classified. And we don't really know what those security controls are going to look like, so we have to define them. So there was essentially two prongs here under what we now call the CUI program, the Controlled Unclassified Information Program. One was normalizing all the markings so that the agencies didn't have 2,000 different markings and they could all share it. The other was what is the minimum set of requirements that you would need to protect the confidentiality of this type of data? And that's how we got a document called NIST Special Publication 800-171, which is a series of security controls specifically tailored to protect the confidentiality of unclassified information that's not classified. It's just data that is sensitive, that shouldn't be shared with everybody. We just want to protect. So it's really like a privacy standard, if you will, where we have some specific data that the government is concerned about, like PII, like technical data, like tax data, all kinds of unclassified information. Not classified, but still needs to be protected. Minimum set of requirements. Now, if you're curious how that connects to CMMC, the big flaw in the reasoning here was they created this minimum set of standards and they said, here you go. You're going to do these, right, everyone? And everyone said, yep, we're going to do it. And turns out that nobody did it, right? And we all know at this point, there's lots of reasons why that happened. By and large, 75, 80, 85% of the companies that have these requirements never implemented them. And so the government realized, specifically in the DoD supply chain, that this unclassified information still probably shouldn't just be flowing out of the supply chain to whoever wants it, because it's pieces and parts and plans for weapon systems. They needed to have some assurance that these controls were in place. So they created an assessment program to go in and gauge whether the requirements had been implemented. So CMMC is the program that assesses whether you've implemented the requirements in 800-171. There's been a lot of confusion over the last few years because people think that they are different requirements. They are not. It is the assessment of the pre-existing requirements, and that's how we got CMMC.
Jacob, that was fantastic. I suggest people watching it live to rewind and listen to this part again. Yeah. Because I think that would like turn on the light bulb for a lot of people that trying to figure out what's the connection between CMMC and this document.
You know, and like we said earlier, the DoD, not the best at marketing, because instead of just saying that, they took the requirements in 800-171 and they renamed them. Like they changed the names of all 110 requirements and then said, hey, CMMC is a thing. So everybody who's normal, who doesn't read this stuff every day, they all look up and they go, oh, they're new requirements. So for 2 years, we just went around and around and around. And there's people on LinkedIn and people doing webinars, and half of us are saying they're not new. The other half are going, oh, they're super new. And it was a huge waste of time, essentially, because it's not helping anybody learn how to implement the controls. We're just trying to clarify that they're not new, which, that's definitely on the DoD for not maybe thinking ahead about how confusing that would be.
And in the meantime as well, since, nothing lives in a bubble, there were a lot of things that happened, like the OPM breach, geopolitical tensions and so on, and a lot of in the government. So talk to me about that as well, because those regulations and standards are, they were applied, but they applied out of necessity. And the more time goes by, we realize that this should have been done like a while back as well, because we bleed a lot of data, that can be used against us at some point. And talk to me about kind of what's happening on the outside of the kind of regulations in terms of the situation.
So, the sort of rule of thumb is that cybersecurity regulation, like most regulation, very reactive, right? The law always sort of follows behind reality. And it's funny that you bring up OPM, because that was a driving factor in this sort of timeline. So the government was working on their marking database, their actual, marks for what the data needs to look like. And they were developing the definition of what would be 171. And then OPM happens. And for people that don't know, at the time, it was like the largest data breach in government history. It gave them access to essentially the database that everyone's security clearance information is stored inside of, which is
including biometric data.
Oh yeah, the keys to the kingdom, and that's bad for many reasons. It probably don't need to imagine all of them, but that actually accelerated the release of 800-171, and it was a driving factor that reinforced the fact that the information that OPM had was not classified. It was unclassified information. Still needs to be protected. And until there's a universal definition of what the minimums are, then every agency is just sort of doing their own thing, which sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's way above the minimum, sometimes they're doing nothing. And so OPM was actually a driving force behind the publication of 800-171. The time, I think it was like 30 or 60 days after OPM happened was when the initial version of 800-171 was published, which zooming out a little bit, the CUI program really had three parts to it. There was Obama's executive order that was going to drive all of the federal agencies to manage CUI the same way. Then there is the fact that all of the government agencies interface with their supply chain in some way. So they flow information into the supply chain for lots and lots of reasons. In order to take those minimum requirements and get them into the supply chain to follow the data, you need an acquisition regulation, a clause that would go in the contract with your contractors that says, hey, please protect this data. And that's a whole process of developing what would eventually just be a paragraph in a contract. Now, without the agency side rule and the acquisition side rule for the supply chain, and in the middle, 800-171 and the requirements for everybody, you don't have a program. As of right now, we only have 800-171 and the agency side rule. We don't have the acquisition rule. So everything that's been happening in the DoD space has been because the DoD is able to make their own acquisition regulation as a supplement. So I tell people that everything that you're seeing right now in the DoD space might seem sort of obscure or often left field or a DoD specific thing. It is not. The DoD is, and their supply chain is the canary in the coal mine, because the issues that we see in the industrial base for the DoD are not unique to the DoD. Everybody who is a federal contractor or a subcontractor or a sub-supplier are small businesses without resources, without the money, without the technical staff or the know-how. And 171, remember, is the set of standards government-wide. This is not a DoD-specific regulation. So we're sort of stress testing what it's going to be like when it gets out for everybody. And if anybody hasn't been paying attention, it's not going well, right? When you drop these minimum standards onto the supply chain, stuff breaks, and it breaks hard. And, you know, the DoD is like figuring out how this is working. And there's probably a lot of companies out there who are suddenly going to find themselves in the shoes of the DoD 3 years ago, where they go, what is 171? What is CUI? What do you mean it's going to be Groundhog Day for a lot of people. And, you know, as of right now, based off of the time of this recording, that missing piece, that third piece, the acquisition regulation, should be out in a matter of months. And we've been waiting on it for 5 or 6 years now. A lot of people have forgotten that it's coming, but it's coming, and it's going to be, we'll probably have to do another episode because it's going to make a lot of waves for people.
Yeah, I was about to say we do before we. This is going to be probably maybe a third episode when that comes out, because we still have to do this. I think we have to do a part 2 of this.
Sure.
We're kind of running out of time, but I would love to dig further into the CMC. But one thing I mentioned and that you mentioned it's coming, and I would add to that that we are going to see a CMMC like type of regulation to the private sector as well.
Yeah.
And you can kind of back me up on that.
Yeah.
It's not going to end at the suppliers like, defense contractors and so on.
Right. Well, it's exactly to that point, right? We know that through the experiment of looking at the DoD's handling of this requirement as sort of the spearhead of this issue, that if you drop the minimum requirements and you just rely on what's called self-attestation, you don't have some measure of assurance, then it doesn't work. We just know that this doesn't work because it's ultimately a pinky promise, and that just isn't something. You need assurances, right? And people don't really like compliance. They don't really like governance and auditing, but fundamentally, those are mechanisms that are trying to provide assurances. And so as a taxpayer or as a data owner, right, if you are putting your data into another organization, you want some level of assurance, especially when we know that when we have no assurances, it's not happening organically. Now, the thing to watch for, is, like I said, this is for all agencies. This isn't just for the DoD. Department of Homeland Security, which gets a lot of attention through CISA and a lot of the cybersecurity efforts, they are an agency like everyone else. They have to, deal with CUI just like everybody else. And their rule, we talk about the DFARS, which is the DoD's rule for how they handle this. DHS has their own rule for how to handle CUI. That should be out, by this summer, essentially, summer of 2020. What year is it? 2022. And it'll be.
Is there a name for that, or did they attach a name for it yet?
They haven't. They just said it's a rule. So the thing to watch for, and maybe we'll come back and follow up, is will they drop the requirements and not require any assessment? And we know that it will ultimately just be theater, or will they turn around and go, man, we have to assess to some degree whether people have implemented it. If they do that, will they just borrow CMMC? Will they, because remember, CMMC is just a evaluation program. You can call it whatever you want. They could make up their own. They could call it DHS MMC if they wanted to. Mm-hmm. So the thing to watch for will be the other agencies' rules for CUI will come out. Are they going to assess people? If they do, will they borrow the DoD's program, or will they make up their own? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter because 171 is the minimum. And so whether they assess or not, and if they do, what they call it, will be sort of the thing to watch for as we go forward. There's a lot of regulations coming out. There's a lot of rulemaking going on. But a lot of it in terms of CUI is all part of the same trend that's been coming for years and years.
And, eventually, I think at the end of the rainbow, at the end of that journey, I think everyone is going to benefit, despite the heavy lifting and the choppy road ahead. Yeah. Because again, this is a matter of national security, and we all going to be better off once it's all implemented. But who knows how long this is going to take? Yeah. And Jacob, we'll do another part of this, part B, where we kind of dissect CMMC in general, like how, maybe like some best practices and how to get started. Sure. Get into some sort of maturity level where you're comfortable with getting assessed and what the program looks like. Maybe how to use automation, where you can, it's almost like right now it's almost like black magic in the sense that it's definitely mysterious for people.
It's interesting. If you go back in time and you read ancient NIST documents from 15 or 20 years ago, they're very clear about the difference and the relatedness between two ideas. One is security functionality and one is security assurance. And they say that they are a complementary, they're complementary ideas. You need this functionality, this detailed nitty gritty configuration, what my security functionality is actually doing. But you also need assurances, because as a business owner or as an external stakeholder, as an information owner that is flowing your information into this organization, how do you know that the functionality is operating properly? And at the most fundamental level, it could be SOC 2, it could be ISO 27001, it could be CMMC, it could be NIST controls. They are fundamentally trying to weave together the idea of functionality and assurance. And if you sort of use that lens to see what's going on, somewhere, whatever you happen to end up doing, you're probably on one side or the other. The trick is trying to weave those together, which is a lost art, which is why you say it's like black magic. What do you mean I need to make a case? I know it's working.
When you're a subcontractor, where you're making like some pins for some other system, and all you know is you have a machine, that makes widgets or something, and then all of a sudden you get a requirement letter to renew the contract that says you have to be, you have to follow these guidelines. And I think the first reaction was like, "What the F? What is that?"
Yeah, absolutely. Which I know we're wrapping up, but for just to tie it back to the beginning, for anybody that's interested, the longer the longer we're on this timeline, the more there's going to be more regulation, there's going to be more rulemaking, there's going to be more governance and risk and compliance. Traditionally, the GRC field is like the Hufflepuff of the Harry Potter houses, like not all that cool. When you talk to people, they're like, I want to hack stuff. And you're like, what about policy? Like, what about compliance? Nobody wants to do that. However, it is extremely important, and it's becoming more and more important as we sort of turn the collective idea of security back towards a balance between functionality and assurance. Those skills in the GRC field are ripe for learning, disruption, automation, lots and lots of cool stuff that I think traditionally were not associated with the GRC field. We're still a little early, I think, but anybody who's curious about regulation and how it interfaces with what companies have to do in their security program, GRC is the sort of interface between those two things. CMMC is just one example of, it's just making a lot of noise over there in the corner, but it's just one example of how that's starting to happen.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there's no escape. And what companies should do, is embrace it and say, walk towards the light, not away from the light, to make sure that they can use that to their own advantage to become, for example, more competitive. Right?
Yeah,
because,
absolutely. Well, I mean, just look at, just in the last few weeks, the SEC has released their rules for incident reporting, and cybersecurity minimums are now a part of the publicly traded companies' reporting requirements, which I think is a wonderful development, because security's always played second fiddle to the rest of the business for most organizations, right? Not always, but it's always sort of taken a back seat. You want to accelerate security to have a seat at the table, make it a part of public reporting for SEC regulations, and all of a sudden it's going to be taken very seriously. So you can see it with the SEC. You can see it in the insurance industry. They're wrestling with how to deal with this. You can see it in terms of the CUI program at long last, after 10 years, finally crystallizing into a real regulatory regime here. So it doesn't take very long to look around the corners and see what's coming. And the part that weaves it together is not more technology. That's inevitable. It's how do you translate these two worlds together, which is, to me, I find very interesting. And if anybody else does, there's plenty of work to do, because it has been under-addressed for a while now.
But, Jacob, you mentioned sometimes you're a sucker for punishment. Yeah. You've mentioned it a couple of times, and you've, especially when you... I'll put it to you this way. You choose the path less traveled.
Yeah, I'll put it to you this way. So I'll date myself here for the older millennials and older. So do you remember back in the day when you'd buy a physical video game, and inside the box there was a manual that had like the controls and all the stuff in it? There's effectively two kinds of people in the world. There are people who, like me, who would open the box, they would read the manual cover to cover, and then they would play the game. And there were people like my neighbor when I was growing up who would open the box on the ride home and throw the manual out the window and figure it out as they went, right? You need both types of people, I think, for successful security program. You need the people who are reading the book cover to cover, and you need the people who are freestyling. If you only have one or the other, then you're missing a really important element. So if anybody's out there and if you read the instructions before you played the game, maybe check out GRC, because I think you're going to like it a lot. If you find yourself, uncomfortable around people who are like, we'll figure it out when we get there, maybe look over here for a while and see if you find anything interesting.
And Jacob, I'm not going to mention which group I am, belong to, but we'll keep that for the next episode, just to keep the suspense going. But until then, Jacob, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you? And we'll definitely schedule something again, maybe in the next week or so. But until then, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you? So
I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm posting on there all the time, primarily documenting all this analysis for CMMC and what's not. A lot of that conversation and community is focused on LinkedIn. You can also find us at summit7.us, cmmc.blog, or cmmc.video will take you straight to our YouTube pages. And I think we can link maybe some of the longer form videos that we've done in the past, in case anybody wants more details to sort of how CMMC has evolved and how all the pieces are playing together.
Yeah, fantastic. And I highly recommend checking your LinkedIn page out. A lot of really, I don't know if riveting is the word you can attach to a CMMC, explanatory videos, but we'll use that right now.
That's I can't. That's an amazing description. I mean, thank you so much. That's incredible. I'm gonna go tell my wife. She's like, they find it riveting. And she's like, no, they don't. Nobody finds it riveting.
But until then, thanks everyone for joining. Much appreciated. Stay safe online as well as offline. Looking forward to seeing the next episode.
Thanks David. Bye. See ya.
Take care.